Hello, church. Pastor Chris here, and I wanted to come to you today because we are finally, after a little bit of time, starting our Bible study in Leviticus. And I know you're saying, Chris, wasn't this supposed to come out like 2 weeks ago? And the answer is yes. And the reason why it's taken so long is because I deeply underestimated the richness that is found in Leviticus. I deeply underestimated how much depth there would be. And so I've been reading and I've been studying and I've been going through commentaries and sources and all of these great things in order to try to present for you a digestible and understandable picture of Leviticus. And so I want to start from the beginning of the book, and we're just going to read the very first few words of Leviticus. And the book of Leviticus starts out like this: "And God spoke to Moses." Now you might think, this doesn't sound super profound, but if you have an understanding of the first few books of Scripture, you understand that this is the continuing of a pattern. God speaking directly to God's people and to God's messengers. And so we see in Genesis 1 that God speaks creation into existence. And then we see that God speaks to Adam, and God speaks to Abraham, and God speaks to Isaac, and God speaks to Jacob, and God speaks to Joshua. And we see that there is this continuing of God speaking. God spoke to Moses through the burning bush. And we see again in Leviticus that God is speaking to Moses. But the book of Leviticus is really interesting because maybe the primary purpose of Leviticus is to address the fact that the Israelites feel like they cannot speak to God. You see, there's this problem with the Israelites of understanding the distance of God, and to understand that, we have to go back to Exodus. Now, some of you may know the story of Exodus. After the occurrences in Genesis, Israel found themselves in Egypt, and at first they held a position of power and a position of privilege, but then next thing they know, they found themselves enslaved. And so, after they found themselves enslaved, they cried out to God, and God heard their cries, it says, and then God rescued them from slavery through the 10 signs and wonders and through Moses and Aaron. And we have this great big story of God's power and providence in the people of Israel. But then the people of Israel end up leaving Egypt, and then they go to Mount Sinai, and they find that they still don't really have a way to connect with God. You see, they even say, Moses, you have to be the one to speak to God, because if we speak to God, surely we will die. You see, they've just seen what God did in Egypt, and they've just had 400 years of conditioning in Egypt, seeing that the gods of Egypt are in fact these violent and cruel beings. And so their image of God is skewed, and they feel like they cannot interact with this God. They feel like they can't even come into the presence of this God in any way. And so Moses goes up onto the mountain, and while Moses is up on Mount Sinai, the Israelites do something crazy. They build a golden calf. They form this golden calf image. And we look at that and we say, this is clearly an idol. This is a representation of another God. But for the Israelite people, this was addressing a deeper heart issue that they had. You see, the deeper heart issue is that the Israelites felt like they could not connect with God. They felt like God was this distant being, and Moses had gone up to the mountain, and it even says in the narrative in Exodus 32, the Israelites thought maybe Moses had died up on the mountain, and so how were they going to communicate with God? How were they going to find out the next thing to do? And again, we remember they've had 400 years of conditioning in Egypt about what God is supposed to look like from this skewed Egyptian perspective. And so they build an idol. They build something that they think can stand in as a messenger between them and God. They have this broken image of what it means to communicate with God. And yet they feel like God is this far off and distant being. And then Moses comes down from the mountain, and Moses is rightfully super upset. Moses is like, what are you guys doing? I went up to talk to God, and you guys thought I was dead, so you built a golden calf to talk to God? What sense does that make? It doesn't make any sense. And so then we enter into Exodus chapter 33. And there's this really interesting thing that happens starting in about the 12th verse. You see Moses and God then go have a heart-to-heart. They have a DTR moment in the tent of meeting. And it says, Moses said to God, "Look, you tell me lead this people, but you don't let me know whom you're going to send with me. You tell me I know you well and you are special to me. But if I'm special to you, let me in on your plans. That way I will continue being special to you. Don't forget, this is your people, your responsibility." God said, "My presence will go with you. I'll see this journey to the end." Moses said, "If your presence doesn't take the lead here, call this trip off right now. How else will it be known that you're with me in this, with me and your people? Are you traveling with us or not? How else will we know that we're special, I and your people, among all the other peoples on this planet?" God said to Moses, "All right. Just as you say, this also I will do, for I know you well and you are special to me. I know you by name." Moses said, "Please let me see your glory." God said, "I will make my goodness pass right in front of you. I'll call out the name God right before you. I'll treat well whomever I want to treat well, and I'll be kind to whomever I want to be kind." God continued, "But you may not see my face. No one can see me and live." God said, "Look, here is a place right beside me. Put yourself on this rock. When my glory passes by, I'll put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you with my hand until I've passed by. Then I'll take my hand away and you'll see my back, but you won't see my face." Now this seems like a strange story. This seems to further amplify the distance of God. It seems to say, well, Moses himself can't even look upon the face of God. But that's not what's happening here. What is happening here in this 33rd chapter of Exodus is in fact that God is doing something profound. God is setting a precedent for a means of which the people of God can interact with God. God is allowing the people of God to be able to interact with, even if they can't directly see, to interact with the presence of God. You see, just in the previous chapter, the Israelites built the golden calf, and Moses is confronting God about this, saying, "God, I realize that your people should not have done this, but can you take a little responsibility and realize that the people that you have called do not know you, and they do not have a way to interact with you?" And I wonder if sometimes we find ourselves in a similar place as the Israelites. We find ourselves in a place feeling like God is distant, feeling like we can't hear the voice of God, feeling like we can't see God, feeling like whenever we cry out to God, God isn't listening. And whenever we find ourselves in these moments of isolation, we often end up taking things into our own hands. We do the things that seem practical in the moment. We do the things that seem right and easy to do in the moment, the things that might seem best for us and our families and our friends. And in the midst of that, we leave God out of the equation completely. But what's interesting about this passage in Exodus 33, in which the presence of God moves directly in front of Moses, is that we see that this is setting up a precedent for the tabernacle. The tabernacle would be a place in which the Israelites could encounter, though without seeing, they could encounter and communicate with the presence of God. That they could interact with the presence of God and interact in ways that were pleasing to God and interact with ways that would bring about blessing and goodness and peace in their communities. You see, whenever sometimes we feel that God is distant, our first reaction is to take things into our own hands. Our first instinct, whenever we seek out God's wisdom in our life and we don't hear anything in response, is to sometimes do the things that seem easiest or most convenient. But God is calling us to a new way of living in which God can dwell directly in our midst. You see, I mentioned that this sets up a precedent for the tabernacle. And the word tabernacle directly translates to mean dwell. It means that God dwelled and made himself a neighbor of the Israelites. And we see this happen even deeper in the temple. And we see this happen even deeper in the New Testament whenever we realize that we, in fact, are the temple. That we carry the presence of God wherever we go. And so I know in this time, some of us may be feeling like God is especially distant. We may feel like we can't hear the voice of God. We may feel like we can't see the face of God. We can't smell the good presence of God. Our senses don't seem to work sometimes whenever we are interacting with God. But I would encourage us in these moments to push deeper in realizing that God desires to dwell with us. That God so deeply desires to dwell in our midst that God himself has made God's self our neighbor. That God has set up a place in this world where God can dwell, and as it currently stands, that place is us. And as we continue to journey through the book of Leviticus, we'll be looking at different practices that the Israelites engaged with, different ways in which the Israelites found that they could interact with this God who seemed distant in Exodus, that they could find ways to intimately know their God, to know that their God directly set them aside, but not only to know that, but to know that their God stood out unique amongst the other gods of the world, in that their God wanted to know them. And so I leave you with a couple of questions today, and you can maybe write these down in your journal. You can maybe talk with your families about these. You can maybe talk with your friends about these, but the questions would be this. Has there ever been a time in which you felt like God was distant? Has there ever been a time maybe where you could not hear or feel or sense the presence of God? And then the second question would be this. What are some practices and some moments in your life in which you have been able to see and feel and hear the presence of God? What are some ways in which you have encountered the presence of God? And as we move forward in the rest of this study, I hope and I pray that we will be able to see Leviticus not as this ancient book of laws that no longer apply, but we would be able to read it in the terms of the story that it is, the story that God desired to create a people whose lives were built around God, whose lives were built around this idea of knowing and deeply, intimately being in relationship with God, so that their lives reflected God, so that their families reflected God, so that their relationships reflected God, their politics reflected God. Every single thing about their life reflected God. Because the purpose of Leviticus is a story of an Israelite people finding intimacy with their God, and through that intimacy becoming a priestly kingdom and a holy nation.